one thing that Mouin also does on Twitter now is he's definitely one of the best writers of Twitter threads on just like if I have any like if there's some sort of issue that's come up in the Middle East, he's definitely one of the first pages that I turn to because he will no doubt have an interesting thread that has perspectives that even I'm pro Palestine, so is Mouin obviously, but he offers things that I don't necessarily think about. And one thing that surprised me was you said something like you don't really accept the idea that a large part of the motivation for the Hamas attack is to stall or to totally get rid of the normalization agreements that was going on with Saudi Arabia at the time, and now they seem to be more or less off the table. Can you elaborate a little bit more on
Sure.
that?
Sure. I mean, many observers and analysts in the wake of the attacks of October 7th, again, I think because there really wasn't a compelling explanation for their timing, it's not as if they were responding to something that happened on October 6th or September 6th. And so these attacks, in a sense, could have just as easily taken place a month earlier or a month later and left us with the same questions about timing. And I think probably in that context, quite a few observers and analysts pointed to the efforts to achieve a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement as a primary motivation for Hamas. In other words, what Hamas was hoping to do with this attack, not exclusively, but primarily, was to scuttle the prospect of such an agreement being reached and consummated. I have my doubts for a number of reasons. The first is that the issue at stake was never a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement, or rather, it was never just a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement. It was really a tripartite agreement between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, which was a central party to this agreement had it come to pass. And why was it a central party? Well, because the main benefits Saudi Arabia was seeking to derive from such an agreement would have come not from Israel in terms of anything Israel would be offering to either Saudi Arabia or to the Palestinians, but they were rather American commitments that Riyadh was seeking. And these concerned a formal American security guarantee for Saudi Arabia, akin to security guarantees it gives to its formal allies to defend them from foreign attack and aggression and so on. And and Saudi Arabia was seeking a nuclear reactor with uranium enrichment capacity, civilian, but a nuclear reactor nonetheless. And so what that means is that no agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia would have been possible unless the US Congress, which is the body that would have had to confirm these American commitments and approve them, without the approval of the US Congress for these commitments to US commitments to Saudi Arabia, there would have been no Saudi-Israeli agreement. And in my view, given opposition within Congress to either Saudi Arabia or the Biden administration, or both, and given the very trenchant criticisms and even vilification of Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, among quite a few members of Congress, I reached a conclusion that those commitments were not going to emerge from Washington. A second reason that I didn't think, excuse me, a second reason that I didn't think this agreement would come to pass is because part of the package also consisted of Israeli gestures towards the Palestinians, so that the Saudis, who face, I think, a much more engaged and complex public opinion than does, for example, the United Arab Emirates, so that the Saudi authorities could claim that they were not selling out the Palestinians, but benefiting the Palestinians by reaching an agreement with Israel. Now, it's true that these Israeli gestures towards the Palestinians were primarily cosmetic in nature, but it's also true that this Israeli government is constitutively incapable, allergic to making even superficial cosmetic gestures to the Palestinians. Quite the opposite. It's going out of its way to provoke them, to disempower them, to unleash the violence of the army and its settlers against them, and so on. And so I do think part of the Biden administration's calculations was to go to Netanyahu and say, well, you have to make these gestures towards the Palestinians. And if you can't get them through your current government, then you should change your coalition partners. Well, even there's two problems. First of all, it's not just the radical right-wing members of the government who were commonly described and in some cases describe themselves as fascists that are opposed to these gestures. Netanyahu himself doesn't believe in them. But more importantly, he was not in a position to change the composition of his governing coalition in order to make these gestures, because had he done so, his legislative agenda with respect to the Israeli judiciary, which is of such political and personal significance to him, would no longer be viable. So my initial assessment was that neither Saudi Arabia nor Israel, for reasons of their own, were in a position to make the commitments for such an agreement. But going beyond that, even if I'm wrong, and let's assume for the sake of argument that this agreement was a viable prospect and was even imminent, I'm sure Hamas would have taken 10 minutes out of its preparations to study how previous armed conflicts have affected the process of Arab-Israeli normalization. And here we have concrete evidence. So to take the first and most important Arab-Israeli normalization agreement, the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty of 1979, which removed the most powerful Arab military and what was at the time the most consequential Arab state out of the Arab-Israeli equation and enabled Israel to unleash its 1982 invasion of Lebanon to seek to eradicate the PLO. Well, the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, culminating in the Sabra Shatila massacres in September of that year, had no impact on the process of Egyptian-Israeli normalization. Secondly, if we look at the late 1990s and the Second Intifada, these had no impact on either Egyptian Israeli or Jordanian Israeli normalization. One could even go further and say, well, even the PLO didn't withdraw its recognition of Israel or renounce the Oslo Accords in response to Israeli measures during the Second Intifada, up to and including the construction of the West Bank Wall. And most recently, we have the normalization agreements, the grandiosely entitled Abraham Accords, which remained entirely unaffected by the 2021 Unity uprising, as it's called. So I think Hamas would have recognized that the most they could have achieved with the attacks of the 7th of October would have been to postpone the consummation of any Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement, and to postpone it only for the length of a decent interval once the guns fell silent. And with this knowledge, it seems to me a reasonable conclusion that Hamas would have decided that that wouldn't be worth the effort or worth the price. So I do think that, the regional acquiescence in Israeli unilateralism towards the Palestinians was a background factor, and perhaps even an important background factor. But to identify the prospect of a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement as a prime motivation for Hamas to conduct its attacks, I think, is really a very serious misreading of reality.